The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburban street, painting the houses in soft shades of gold and orange. It was a street where life moved slowly, where neighbors waved hello over fences, and where most days passed without much excitement. But for one homeowner, the calm of the morning was always tinged with a little anxiety. They knew, almost without fail, that another confrontation was waiting somewhere nearby. The mailbox, their simple metal box at the edge of the lawn, had been destroyed more times than they could count. Each time under circumstances that seemed impossible to ignore, it all started with small annoyances. At first, it was only minor scratches and dents, which could easily be brushed off as accidents. The first time it happened, they thought maybe the wind had blown something into it, or a delivery truck had brushed past. But when it happened a second time, just a few weeks later, it became harder to believe it was random. And by the third, fourth, and fifth incidents, there was no denying it. Someone was targeting them. It was personal. Neighbors often remarked about how strange it was. "Maybe you're imagining things," some would say. Mailboxes get hit all the time. But those who lived on the street knew better. This homeowner had tried to keep peace, to live quietly without stirring conflict, yet trouble seemed drawn to them. And at the center of it all was one neighbor, infamous on the block for being difficult and controlling, always looking for ways to assert power over others, and never taking responsibility for their actions. The morning that would start the next chapter of this story began like any other. The homeowner stepped outside, sipping a cup of coffee, enjoying the crisp air. Birds were chirping, and the light breeze carried the scent of freshly mowed grass from a nearby yard. Everything seemed peaceful, but the mailbox, standing alone at the edge of the property, caught their attention immediately. The paint was scratched in multiple places, and the door hung slightly crooked. It was another attack, another reminder that someone was playing a game they didn't agree to. There was a sinking feeling in their chest. They had reported incidents to the local homeowners association before, and yet each time the response was slow and ineffectual. Rules were cited, forms filled out, polite warnings issued, and then nothing changed. The HOA often seemed more interested in maintaining appearances than actually enforcing rules or protecting residents. It left the homeowner feeling helpless, frustrated, and constantly on edge. They had thought about ignoring it, about letting it go. But each new incident chipped away at that patience. Leaving a rising anger they struggled to contain, they walked closer to inspect the damage. Tracing the scratches with a gloved hand, the metal was bent at odd angles, clearly caused by more than just weather or accidents. Their mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of the repeated destruction. Could it be vandals from outside the neighborhood? Unlikely. The timing, the consistency, and the targeted nature of the attacks all pointed to someone who lived nearby. Someone who knew their routines. Someone who watched and waited. The neighbor in question lived directly across the street. A house marked by overly manicured bushes and bright, unyielding colors. They were known for their strict views on property lines, for scolding children who played too close to the curb, and for constantly monitoring the street from their front porch. Their presence was intimidating. Not violent in the traditional sense, but heavy, like an unspoken rule that life should be lived exactly according to their standards. In the past, attempts at dialogue had ended poorly. Polite requests were met with defensive denial, sometimes even threats, all wrapped in a veneer of civility that made confrontation awkward. It was frustrating because the homeowner didn't want a feud. They just wanted to live without fear that every morning would reveal new damage to their property. But it had become clear that intentions didn't matter here. Actions spoke louder than words, and someone was using those actions to assert dominance. After inspecting the mailbox, they decided it was time to take action, but carefully. Installing cameras had been suggested by a friend, and after much deliberation, they had set up a discreet security system around the property. Cameras were positioned to capture the mailbox, the front yard, and even portions of the street. It was not just for evidence, but also for peace of mind. The homeowner needed to know that if something happened again, there would be proof that could not be disputed or ignored. The next step was to replace the damaged mailbox. They went to a nearby store, choosing a model that was sturdier than before. One designed to withstand both weather and potential tampering. They spent extra time selecting a design that balanced strength with aesthetics, wanting their property to look cared for and respected. Back home, they carefully installed it, making sure it was anchored firmly in the ground, hoping this time it would hold. While the physical act of replacing the mailbox was straightforward, the emotional toll was heavier. Each repair felt like a small victory, but it was always followed by worry. The lingering thought that this cycle could continue indefinitely. They wondered why anyone would take such satisfaction in disrupting someone else's life, in asserting power through petty destruction. It was a question without an easy answer, one that left them both angry and saddened. As days passed, the neighborhood watched with quiet curiosity. Some residents sympathized, but stayed out of it, not wanting to become involved in what they viewed as a personal dispute. Others whispered about the tension, trading stories of their own minor conflicts or shared experiences with the neighbor across the street. The homeowner, meanwhile, tried to maintain normal routines, morning coffee on the porch, walks down the street, and friendly waves to passing neighbors, but each moment was shadowed by the knowledge that any day could bring another incident. One afternoon, as they were checking the mail, a delivery driver mentioned seeing someone loitering near the curb across the street. The homeowner's heart sank, recognizing the familiar posture and stance of their difficult neighbor. They didn't confront them directly at the moment, not wanting to escalate a situation in public. Instead, they made a mental note of the behavior and returned inside, feeling a mixture of frustration and anticipation. They knew that confrontation would come eventually, but it had to be handled carefully. Patience and strategy were required. This was not just about a mailbox. It was about reclaiming a sense of control and dignity. Evenings became moments of reflection. Sitting by the window, the homeowner watched the sunset over the quiet street, thinking about fairness, boundaries, and human behavior. Why did some people feel the need to dominate or intimidate? Why did small actions like damaging a mailbox carry such disproportionate emotional weight? These were not just theoretical questions. They were personal, immediate, and pressing. The mailbox, while a small physical object, represented safety, respect, and a private space that belonged solely to them. Each attack was a violation, and each repair a reminder that vigilance was necessary. Over time, the homeowner developed a system. They documented every incident meticulously, noting dates, times, weather conditions, and any potential witnesses. This record-keeping was not just practical. It was therapeutic. Writing down events provided a sense of order amidst chaos, a way to reclaim some control in a situation that otherwise seemed governed by the whims of someone else. It was a slow, steady preparation for a confrontation that they knew could not be avoided forever. In parallel, the homeowner began speaking cautiously with neighbors, testing the waters to gauge their awareness and support. Most admitted they had noticed odd behavior, but few had the courage to speak up or intervene. The community, while friendly on the surface, often preferred to avoid conflict, leaving the homeowner to navigate the challenge largely alone. Yet even in isolation, they felt a growing determination. They were not looking for revenge, only fairness. They wanted a simple life free from fear, where their property and peace of mind were respected. Nights were sometimes restless. Dreams replayed incidents in exaggerated forms, mixing reality and imagination. The mailbox, a simple metal box, became a symbol in these dreams, a symbol of resilience, frustration, and the human desire for respect. In the quiet hours, the homeowner reflected on their own responses. Anger flared at times, but they also recognized the importance of patience and strategy. Each action taken, each decision made, had to be deliberate. The goal was resolution, not retaliation. Friends offered advice, ranging from legal steps to practical home improvements. Some suggested involving the police more directly, while others recommended community mediation. The homeowner listened carefully, weighing each option. The challenge was finding a balance between protecting themselves and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Every choice carried potential consequences, and the stakes felt higher than they should for what was essentially a dispute over a small object. But as anyone who has faced persistent harassment knows, it is never really about the object. It is about respect, boundaries, and the quiet assertion of one's right to live without interference. By the end of the first week, after replacing the mailbox, life continued. But the shadow of anticipation lingered. Each day brought cautious optimism that perhaps the cycle had ended, but past experience tempered hope. The homeowner's eyes lingered on the street, on the houses across, on familiar faces. They were ready to respond, to gather evidence, to assert their rights, and to protect their home. Yet beneath the vigilance lay a quiet wish that all this trouble could be avoided, that normalcy could return, and that peace could finally settle on the street. The struggle had just begun. But so had the journey toward reclaiming control, dignity, and the simple joy of living without fear of petty destruction. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet neighborhood continued its usual rhythm. But tension simmered just beneath the surface. The homeowner tried to go about their life as normally as possible, tending the garden, checking the mail, and walking around the block for exercise. Yet, there was always a sense of watchfulness, an almost constant awareness that anything could happen at any moment. The mailbox, sturdy and new, seemed to mock the homeowner with its silent resilience. Daring anyone to interfere? One afternoon, the homeowner noticed the neighbor across the street standing on their porch, arms crossed, staring at the mailbox. The posture was familiar, dismissive, controlling, a look that said the world should conform to their will. It was subtle, almost casual, but unmistakable. The homeowner felt a flicker of irritation, but held back, deciding that confrontation in front of witnesses would only escalate matters. Instead, they noted the observation, recording the time and circumstances in a small notebook they had begun keeping. Every glance, every suspicious movement was documented. A strategy they had developed over countless incidents. Evenings became a time for reflection and planning. The homeowner went over options for protecting their property and ensuring accountability. Legal advice was considered, but before taking formal action, they wanted undeniable proof of wrongdoing. Cameras had been installed strategically, capturing not only the mailbox but also approaches to the front yard and portions of the street. This precaution offered some peace, but also a strange tension. They were no longer simply living in the neighborhood. They were monitoring it, analyzing every movement, every shadow, every sound that could indicate potential trouble. The tension escalated further. When a package was delivered to the mailbox late one afternoon, it was a special delivery, something they had been anticipating for weeks. As they opened the front door, they noticed the neighbor casually strolling across the street, glancing toward the mailbox. Their instincts screamed that something was about to happen. They tried to focus on other things, reminding themselves not to assume the worst. But past experience had taught them caution was warranted. Just as they stepped back into the yard, the neighbor approached, pretending to be concerned. "I hope your mailbox is holding up," they said, voice light but edged with subtle hostility. The homeowner smiled politely, nodding without responding to the implied accusation. There was no need to escalate verbally. The mailbox itself would speak if anything happened next. Yet the brief encounter left a chill, a reminder that peace was fragile and that vigilance was still required. Later that week, another minor incident occurred, though this time it was different. A small branch had fallen across the yard, leaning near the mailbox. It looked accidental, but its placement felt deliberate, almost mocking. The homeowner carefully moved the branch, examining its position and considering possible motives. It was an unsettling reminder that harassment could be subtle, and that psychological stress was as impactful as physical damage. They realized that patience was being tested in ways that went beyond the tangible, and that every day required both mental and emotional fortitude. The homeowner decided it was time to reach out to local authorities, not for immediate confrontation, but for advice and documentation. They explained the repeated mailbox damage, the subtle intimidation, and the neighborhood dynamics. The official response was polite but non-committal. The authorities suggested continuing documentation, installing cameras, and avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. It was good advice, but it also highlighted how slow and bureaucratic the process could be. The homeowner understood that resolution would take time and careful navigation. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood went on. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware of the undercurrent of tension that had taken root on the block. Some were sympathetic, offering casual words of encouragement or observing incidents from a distance. Others remained indifferent, preferring to avoid involvement. This mix of support and apathy created an odd dynamic, leaving the homeowner both isolated and cautiously hopeful. They knew that relying solely on others could be risky, and that self-reliance, combined with careful planning, was essential. As days passed, the homeowner began to notice patterns. Certain times of day seemed to coincide with the neighbor's surveillance of the mailbox. Morning deliveries, late afternoon walks, and even occasional night routines were all observed. It became clear that this was not random behavior, but deliberate monitoring. A subtle form of intimidation meant to unsettle and control. The homeowner documented everything, creating a detailed timeline that would later become essential if formal action was required. One morning, a particularly stressful encounter occurred. The neighbor appeared in their yard, ostensibly checking on a minor maintenance issue, but their true intent was clear. They lingered longer than necessary, watching every movement, asking pointed questions about the mailbox and recent deliveries. The homeowner responded politely, keeping their tone neutral, aware that any outburst could be used against them. After the neighbor finally left, a heavy sense of relief settled over the yard, though anxiety remained. This incident reinforced the need for continued vigilance and careful planning. Despite the stress, the homeowner found moments of resilience. Gardening became a form of therapy, a way to focus energy on creation rather than conflict. Walks around the neighborhood were reframed as opportunities to observe without confrontation, to enjoy the small pleasures of suburban life despite the underlying tension. Even simple routines, like checking the mailbox or brewing a cup of coffee, were imbued with a sense of mindfulness, turning moments that could have been filled with fear into exercises in awareness and patience. The psychological toll, however, was undeniable. Sleepless nights and lingering thoughts of confrontation weighed heavily. The homeowner recognized the importance of managing emotional health, practicing deep breathing and reflection to stay calm and focused. They reminded themselves that their goal was resolution, not retaliation. That careful strategy would ultimately be more effective than impulsive reactions. Each day became a test of patience, challenged to remain calm in the face of subtle intimidation and repeated provocation. Community dynamics also played a role. Casual conversations with neighbors revealed that others had experienced minor disputes with the same individual across the street. Stories of small conflicts, overgrown plants, noise complaints, and petty arguments painted a picture of someone used to asserting dominance in subtle but consistent ways. The homeowner felt a mixture of validation and frustration, realizing they were not alone in dealing with such behavior, yet also aware that collective action was unlikely due to fear of reprisal or social friction. As part 2 of this story unfolded, the homeowner began preparing for more decisive action. Legal counsel was sought, evidence was meticulously gathered, and a plan was formed. The new mailbox remained strong, standing as both a literal and symbolic barrier against ongoing harassment. The homeowner understood that confrontation, when it came, would need to be measured and backed by undeniable proof. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about establishing boundaries and reclaiming peace. The days continued, each passing moment building anticipation and tension. The homeowner balanced vigilance with normal life, finding solace in routine and small pleasures. Every glance at the street, every observation of neighbors' behaviors, and every careful note in their journal contributed to a growing strategy. The sense of being watched was heavy, but it also sharpened awareness and reinforced determination. Finally, one afternoon, a subtle but unmistakable signal indicated that the neighbor's behavior was escalating. A delivery truck arrived, and the neighbor appeared unusually close, standing directly where they could observe the mailbox clearly. The homeowner noticed immediately, heart rate quickening, yet remained composed. They had anticipated such moves and were prepared, cameras recording, evidence accumulating. The stage was being set for a confrontation, not of words but of undeniable truth. By the end of this period, the homeowner's resolve had grown. They were no longer merely reacting. They were preparing to take control of the situation in a measured, intelligent way. Documentation, evidence, patience, and strategic observation had become tools of empowerment. The neighborhood may have remained quiet on the surface, but beneath the calm, a carefully crafted plan was forming, one that would eventually challenge the repeated intimidation and subtle harassment. Laying the groundwork for accountability and resolution, the days that followed were tense, but also strangely focused. The homeowner had moved from a place of worry to careful observation. Every movement on the street, every shadow across the lawn, and every unusual sound was noted and recorded. Cameras had captured plenty of subtle activity already, but now it was about waiting for the definitive proof. Patience had become a tool, and they understood that acting too soon could weaken their case. They were learning the delicate balance between vigilance and calm, turning anxiety into a quiet form of empowerment. It was a bright morning when the critical moment finally arrived. The homeowner was inside performing routine chores when they noticed movement outside through the window. Across the street, the neighbor was lingering near the curb, pretending to check something on their property. But the body language was unmistakable, a subtle indication that attention was focused elsewhere. The homeowner felt a familiar tension rising, yet this time it was tempered with the knowledge that cameras were recording everything, capturing the actions in real time. They remained still, quietly watching as events unfolded. A delivery truck pulled up, and the homeowner saw the neighbor subtly inch closer, positioning themselves so that the mailbox and the homeowner's movements could be observed. It was deliberate, calculated, and for the first time, the intent to intimidate was captured clearly on camera. Every subtle glance, every careful step was documented. The homeowner, though tense, focused on ensuring that the mailbox remained secure, was taking care not to give the neighbor any reason to claim they were overreacting. Evidence was building steadily, one calculated observation at a time. After the delivery was completed, the neighbor lingered, pretending to adjust a lawn ornament, but clearly still watching the mailbox. The homeowner made a note in their journal, describing the posture, the direction of gaze, and the timing. This was no longer random behavior. It was deliberate surveillance, part of a larger pattern that had spanned months. The realization brought a mixture of satisfaction and relief. At last, there was proof that could not be disputed, that clearly showed intentional actions aimed at intimidation. Later that day, the homeowner reviewed the footage with care. Every angle, every movement, every small detail was analyzed. They noticed things they had not observed in real time, subtle gestures that added to the narrative. The neighbor had tried to appear casual, but their body language betrayed a sense of control and expectation. It was clear that their actions were meant to unsettle, to make the homeowner feel watched and powerless. The evidence was undeniable, and a sense of validation began to replace some of the anxiety that it had dominated previous weeks. The homeowner began considering the next steps carefully. The goal was not revenge. It was accountability. They thought about involving local authorities and legal channels, ensuring that actions would be recognized and addressed officially. At the same time, there was a personal need for closure, for the peace that had been disrupted for so long. This required a thoughtful approach, combining patience, evidence, and careful communication. The homeowner was learning that control could be reclaimed through strategy, observation, and calm determination. Evenings offered moments of reflection. The homeowner would sit by the window, sipping tea, reviewing the day's observations, planning for future contingencies. The act of documenting everything had become almost therapeutic, turning moments of anxiety into exercises in clarity and preparation. They understood that the neighborhood itself could not be relied upon for support, and that personal vigilance was essential. Yet, the work was not just defensive. It was empowering, a reclaiming of space, dignity, personal agency. At times, the neighbor attempted indirect intimidation. A car would slow near the property, or a shadow would linger near the mailbox. The homeowner, now experienced in reading these behaviors, remained composed. They knew that overreaction could undermine their position. Instead, They allowed cameras to capture everything, quietly observing while maintaining the outward appearance of calm. It was a delicate dance of patience and awareness, one that required emotional control and careful timing. As days turned into weeks, small victories accumulated. Packages arrived safely, the mailbox remained intact, and the homeowner's careful documentation created a narrative that was increasingly difficult to dispute. There was a growing sense of empowerment, a realization that patience, observation, and evidence could provide protection in ways that confrontation alone could not. The situation had evolved from mere annoyance into a structured challenge, one that demanded strategy, persistence, and intelligence. Interactions with the neighbor continued, though now they were monitored and documented. Brief exchanges at the curb, casual greetings, and minor comments were all logged. Every detail contributed to the growing evidence, creating a record that was objective and undeniable. The homeowner remained polite, careful to maintain composure, while inwardly analyzing the neighbor's behavior, looking for patterns and predictable actions. Each observation provided insight into the motives, the methods, the personality behind the harassment. During this period, the homeowner also focused on personal resilience. Stress management became a priority, with walks, gardening, and simple routines serving as outlets for emotional energy. Mental exercises in calmness and observation helped to maintain focus, reducing the impact of anxiety and frustration. They realized that enduring harassment was not only about physical protection, but also about maintaining mental and emotional well-being, ensuring that reactions were measured, strategic, and effective. Occasionally, neighbors would comment on the visible security measures, asking if the homeowner had been having trouble. These brief conversations reinforced the reality of the situation, confirming that the actions were not imagined. Yet most people remained unwilling to intervene directly, highlighting the isolation often felt by those experiencing harassment. The homeowner relied on self-reliance, careful documentation, and thoughtful planning as their main tools, understanding that support from the community was limited. Then came the moment that would change the dynamic. One morning, a routine inspection of the mailbox revealed subtle but clear signs of tampering. Nothing destructive, yet enough to indicate intent. The cameras had captured every movement, providing undeniable evidence that the neighbor had been involved. The homeowner felt a mix of emotion, satisfaction at having proof, relief that actions were documented, and determination to move forward with measured steps. The situation was no longer abstract. It was concrete, actionable, and undeniable. The homeowner contacted authorities, presenting the footage and documentation. The response was immediate and professional. Investigators reviewed the material carefully, noting the clarity and consistency of the evidence. The neighbor's actions were undeniable, and the potential consequences were becoming real. The homeowner felt a shift in power dynamics, a sense that justice might finally be possible. The months of careful observation, patience, and documentation were beginning to yield results. Meanwhile, life continued around the neighborhood. The streets remained quiet, the days routine, but the tension had shifted. The neighbor, now aware that actions were recorded and documented, began to change behavior subtly. There was less overt intimidation, more careful posturing, and an attempt to appear casual. The homeowner observed these changes, recognizing them as signs of accountability and the first indications of consequences taking effect. The balance of power was shifting slowly but surely, and the homeowner's careful strategy was proving effective. In reflection, the homeowner understood the lessons of this period. Harassment often begins subtly, escalating in ways that test patience and resolve. Evidence, documentation, and strategic observation are essential tools in reclaiming control. Emotional resilience, careful planning, and calm composure are equally important. The mailbox, a simple object, had become a symbol of personal agency, a focal point for testing patience, observation, and strategic thinking. Through it, the homeowner had learned not only about defense, but also about the power of careful, deliberate action. By the end of this chapter, the homeowner was no longer merely reacting. They were preparing for the next steps with confidence, understanding that the culmination of evidence and strategy would eventually lead to resolution. The journey had been long and mentally taxing, but it had also been empowering. The mailbox stood strong, cameras recorded diligently, and the homeowner's patience and careful planning had created a foundation for accountability, justice, and a return to peace. The days that followed the presentation of evidence brought a noticeable shift. The neighbor, who had once acted with an air of unchecked confidence, began to behave differently. They were more careful, more hesitant, as if each step was weighed against unseen consequences. The homeowner, observing from their porch and through the security cameras, felt a cautious sense of relief. The months of patience, vigilance, and careful documentation were finally yielding visible results. It was a subtle victory, but a victory nonetheless. For the first time in a long while, the mailbox sat undisturbed, its metal clean and intact. Deliveries arrived on time, packages were left without incident. The small structure had become a symbol of resilience and justice. The homeowner still remained alert, of course, knowing that vigilance could not be entirely abandoned. But the atmosphere had shifted. The constant tension that had accompanied daily routines was easing, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. Each day without incident was a small reassurance that the strategy was working. The authorities had not only received the evidence, but had acted upon it in measured ways. Letters were sent, warnings issued, and the neighbor was officially informed that further harassment could result in more serious consequences. The homeowner had resisted the urge to react impulsively or escalate the situation themselves. Understanding that legal and procedural channels were more effective than confrontation, this careful approach had placed the responsibility squarely on the neighbor's shoulders, making accountability unavoidable. Interestingly, the neighborhood dynamics began to change as well. Other residents, who had once been silent observers, started to notice the shift. Some whispered about the neighbor's sudden caution and altered behavior, while others quietly supported the homeowner, offering words of encouragement or casual gestures of solidarity. The sense of isolation that had characterized previous months slowly began to lift, replaced by a subtle but growing acknowledgement that boundaries, when enforced correctly, could be respected. Despite the relief, the homeowner remained grounded in caution. They knew that resolution was not yet complete and that subtle provocations could still occur. The cameras were maintained and monitored, the journal of incidents continued, and daily routines included careful observation of the street. This balance of vigilance and cautious optimism was essential. It was not a return to naive trust, but a careful recalibration of expectations based on evidence and experience. One afternoon, the homeowner noticed something unusual. The neighbor, once assertive in their subtle intimidation, appeared flustered, rushing to adjust a garden ornament that had long been crooked. Their movements were hurried, eyes darting occasionally toward the street, as if anxious about being observed. The homeowner's heart lifted slightly. This was more than a simple change in behavior. It was a sign that accountability was taking root, that consequences, however indirect, were influencing actions and attitudes. The psychological impact of this period was profound. The homeowner reflected on the months of tension, the sleepless nights, and the constant mental strain. There had been times when frustration and anger had threatened to overwhelm patience, but strategic thinking and careful documentation had carried the day. The mailbox, once a source of repeated anxiety, had become a tool for asserting personal boundaries and reclaiming a sense of control. Its intact presence symbolized resilience, planning, and the quiet power of consistency. Interactions with the neighbor became more guarded, more formal. Casual greetings were brief, words measured, and any lingering gestures of intimidation noticeably reduced. The homeowner observed these interactions closely, noting tone, posture, and body language. It was clear that the warnings, combined with documented evidence, had created a sense of caution and hesitation in the neighbor. They no longer acted with impunity. Each step was calculated, each movement weighed against potential consequences. Justice, subtle but undeniable, was asserting itself. During this period, the homeowner also focused on personal growth and resilience. Gardening became a daily ritual, not just for beauty, but as a method of mindfulness and stress relief. Walks around the neighborhood were enjoyed more consciously, observing natural changes, local birds, and the small details of everyday life. These routines provided a grounding sense of normalcy, counteracting the tension of previous months. The homeowner realized that maintaining emotional and mental health was as important as securing physical property, and that balance was key to sustained resilience. The mailbox continued to stand as a symbol, its metal surface gleaming in the sunlight, its presence a quiet testament to patience, vigilance, and strategy. Packages arrived, letters were safely delivered, and the homeowner felt a renewed sense of peace. Yet they remained cautious, aware that vigilance must be maintained even in moments of apparent resolution. The journey had taught that even small victories required careful stewardship, and that peace achieved through strategy was more durable than that one through confrontation alone. The community, though not directly involved, became a subtle backdrop to this narrative. Conversations with neighbors revealed small acknowledgments of the situation, passing remarks about the neighbor's changed demeanor, comments on the homeowner's patience and composure. These exchanges, though minor, reinforced the sense that boundaries, once enforced properly, were respected and recognized. The quiet power of evidence, patience, and strategy had reshaped not only the immediate dynamic but also the broader social perception. Evenings were spent reviewing footage, noting small behaviors, and reflecting on progress. The homeowner was no longer consumed by fear or frustration, but was instead focused on maintaining and reinforcing the positive changes that had begun to appear. Each recorded observation, each note in the journal, each careful measurement of behavior contributed to a growing sense of mastery over a situation that had once felt unpredictable and overwhelming. The journey from tension to cautious peace was unfolding steadily, and the mailbox remained at the heart of it all. One evening, a significant milestone occurred. The homeowner reviewed security footage and noticed the neighbor deliberately stepping back, avoiding areas where surveillance was clear, and adjusting behavior in a way that indicated awareness of being monitored. It was an unmistakable sign that the previous months of patience and strategy had created real consequences. The neighbor's confidence had been tempered, their assertiveness replaced by caution. The homeowner felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that accountability had begun to manifest, not through confrontation, but through the careful application of evidence and observation. The psychological relief was palpable. Sleep became more restful, and daily routines no longer carried the heavy undercurrent of anxiety. The homeowner could focus more fully on personal pursuits, on hobbies, and on maintaining a sense of normalcy. The mailbox, once a source of stress and confrontation, had become a quiet emblem of perseverance and the tangible results of strategic patience. The months of careful observation, documentation, and measured responses were yielding not only external changes, but also internal growth and resilience. Throughout this period, the homeowner remained humble about their approach. They did not boast about the changes, did not seek attention, but continued to maintain vigilance and composure. The balance between patience, observation, and strategic action had proven effective, and they understood that true resolution required ongoing attention. The mailbox, intact and undisturbed, stood as a reminder of what could be achieved through measured, thoughtful effort. By the end of this phase, the homeowner had achieved a sense of cautious equilibrium. The mailbox remained secure, the neighbor's behavior had shifted, and the community, though quietly, acknowledged the change. The lessons of patience, resilience, and strategic action had been learned and internalized. The journey from tension to accountability had been long and challenging, but it had also been empowering. The homeowner's careful approach had ensured not only the protection of property, but also the restoration of personal peace and dignity. It was a quiet, satisfying victory, one built on vigilance, evidence, and the enduring power of careful, thoughtful action. The final chapter of this long struggle brought a sense of resolution that had been absent for months. The homeowner awoke one morning to the calm of a quiet street, sunlight streaming across the lawn and reflecting off the mailbox that had once been a source of constant worry. It stood unbroken, secure, and as a symbol of the patience and strategy that had carried them through so many trying days. The air felt lighter, not because the challenge was entirely over, but because the balance of power had shifted and accountability was now firmly in place. Throughout the weeks, the neighbor had become increasingly cautious. There were no more subtle intimidations, no lingering glances, no carefully calculated proximity. Every step was measured, every movement restrained. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable, and the homeowner observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. There was no need for confrontation or dramatics. The evidence, combined with the legal awareness that now existed, had guided the neighbor to a more respectful position. Justice had taken its course through patient observation. In careful documentation, the homeowner spent the morning walking around the yard, noting how the flowers had grown, the way sunlight fell on the freshly painted mailbox, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood that now felt safe. Months of tension had left a mark on their spirit, but the recent calm allowed them to breathe deeply and enjoy the simple pleasures of their surroundings. The mailbox, once a source of stress and fear, had become a tangible reminder of resilience, vigilance, and the quiet power of deliberate action. Neighbors began to notice the changes as well. Conversations in passing became warmer. Brief smiles exchanged over fences were genuine, and there was a subtle acknowledgement of the homeowner's perseverance. Some neighbors mentioned hearing about the warnings sent to the difficult resident across the street and noted the shift in behavior. While few intervened directly, the collective awareness created a subtle sense of community support. The homeowner felt validated, not because they sought recognition, but because it affirmed that their approach had been both effective and just. Life turned to a rhythm that had been missing for months. Mail was delivered without incident. Packages arrived safely, and the mailbox remained undisturbed. The homeowner could focus on daily routines, hobbies, and personal interests without the shadow of worry that had defined the previous seasons. Each day without conflict reinforced the lesson that patience, careful observation, and measured responses were far more powerful than impulsive actions or confrontational approaches. The quiet strength of strategy had brought peace, and with it, a renewed sense of agency and confidence. The psychological relief was profound. Sleep was deeper, mornings were lighter, and anxiety had significantly diminished. The homeowner reflected on the months of tension and realized that while the mailbox had been the object of dispute, it had also been the lens through which they learned resilience, patience, and the value of strategic thinking. Every scratch, dent, and episode of subtle intimidation had provided lessons in vigilance, calm observation, and the importance of evidence in reclaiming control. The neighbor, for their part, remained subdued but functional. They moved about the property with care, avoided unnecessary interactions, and refrained from past behaviors that had created fear and disruption. The subtle shifts in posture, tone, and proximity indicated an internal acknowledgement of boundaries and consequences. It was not out of friendship or newfound kindness, but out of an understanding that actions had measurable effects and that accountability was unavoidable. The homeowner watched this transformation quietly, understanding that the shift was a direct result of patience and consistent strategic response. During this period, the homeowner also focused on strengthening personal boundaries beyond physical property. Confidence grew in the ability to respond calmly to provocation, to maintain composure in the face of subtle intimidation, and to leverage evidence effectively when necessary. Each day of peace reinforced the idea that power often lies not in confrontation but in the disciplined application of strategy, as patience and observation. The mailbox, intact and resilient, stood as a symbol of these lessons realized.